start the stream because we got to go. And if I have time, I'd like to discuss something with you guys at the end.
Oh no, we're on the short.
No, you're fine. Perhaps something for next week before the finals start. Maybe an optional extra credit opportunity. So we'll see. Why are these lights on? All right. So, World War II, the big thing right here at the end. So let's just jump right into it. Oh, good. It's going to be slow today. So, as we saw, the United States didn't join the League of Nations, but we were still involved with international affairs because, I mean, you know, we can't not be involved with stuff. With the Kellogg-Briand Pact that outlawed war as an instrument of foreign policy, but you can't really enforce that. Roosevelt did extend diplomatic recognition to the Soviet Union, yada, yada, yada. There was a lot of political isolationism in the United States to avoid being pulled into another war. There was all sorts of novels and other, you know, forms of literature and literary work, you know, movies and whatnot, decrying the brutality of the war, and also even Senate hearings that said that bankers, ammunition makers, the merchants of death had conspired with you know, foreign powers to push the United States into war. And, you know, if they say bankers, they're talking about Jews because, you know, anti-Semitism. So here's the thing to talk about, the Neutrality Acts, which means that's important. So know that. So when we review on Monday, we're not sitting here looking at each other the whole time. This was created to make it more difficult for the U.S. to be pulled into war for a bunch of reasons, but long story short, that's what the Neutrality Acts were for. You can tell by the name, it's meant to keep the U.S. neutral. Obviously, things in Europe made neutrality difficult. For those of you that are in both of my classes, we've seen in great detail what was going on in Europe, but the Cliff Notes version, hey, Hitler was happening. Scapegoating Jews and communists, rallying Germany behind him due to what happened in World War I, taking land in Rhineland and Czechoslovakia. England and France were letting it happen because they didn't want another war. But, you know, it seems like appeasement doesn't really work. And, well, I'll get into that in just a second. Italy under Mussolini was doing the same thing, although actually was doing that first, but Hitler did it more quickly and on a bigger scale. And then they helped the fascist general Francisco Franco in the Spanish Civil War. It was actually a test for the German Luftwaffe, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. So here is the British Prime Minister, shoot, I lost his name. How did I lose his name? It was before Churchill. How did I lose the dingbat's name? Well, he doesn't really matter. So there was this whole idea of appeasement where it's like, oh, well, we'll just let Germany have all this land in Czechoslovakia to keep us out of war, you know, because that's a good thing. And we'll just ignore the fact that we're giving the land in Czechoslovakia to Germany to keep us out of a war, at least for a little while. And then we still have people like, literally this year, well, why don't we just give that Ukrainian land to Russia, and then they'll leave people alone. It's like, This is literally the only history we teach people in America is about World War II, and you're still doing dumb stuff. It's like just when you give an aggressor land, it doesn't stop them. Anyway, U.S. neutrality, yada, yada, yada. We're going to talk about the America First Committee. And if you pay attention to the news at all, that might sound familiar. We'll talk about that. This is Guernica. This is a piece by Pablo Picasso. This is his depiction of the night bombings in Spain by the Luftwaffe. The chaos and death of being woken up in the middle of the night by your city being suddenly bombed from the air. And he premiered this at a, I want to say it was at a World Fair, and Germany was there, and they were pissed. This was before World War II happened. Yeah, it was a whole thing. And this is some of the results of that. This wasn't just some light bombing. It was, destroying entire cities. So obviously all this led to war in Europe. Poland was invaded. France and Britain declared war on Germany, and also Italy, because Italy was there. Italy was allied with Germany, but they really don't come into it too much. Germany and the Soviet Union technically declared a non-aggression pact so they could carve up Eastern Europe, at least for a little while. We'll get into that later. So Roosevelt wanted to maintain neutrality, and most Americans were pretty cool with that, at least until Paris fell in 1940, and people were like, oh wait, this is bad. Like in World War I, the Germans moved westward and then they were stopped, and then it was just like trench warfare for years. But now it's like, oh wait, all of continental Europe is under German control. That's not how things went last time. So it was Britain by itself fighting off the Luftwaffe in the Battle of Britain, which was like a multi-month-long air war. The Royal Air Force against the Luftwaffe. And then for the next several months, we had the Blitz, which was just constant bombing runs. There were still those in America who opposed going to the war. We had the America First Committee, as I mentioned. They blamed Eastern bankers, British sympathizers, and Jewish leaders for promoting war fervor. They also admired Hitler and the Luftwaffe. They were very anti-Semitic. We have an America First Committee today who happen to be very anti-Semitic and also all of this. Weird that a lot of them are neo-Nazis. Strange how that works. So Roosevelt and a lot of political leaders knew that we had to get involved, but we had to be cautious about it. So Roosevelt sent 50 obsolete destroyers to the British because, of course, they were dealing with U-boats. Selective Service Act, the first peacetime draft in the U.S. My grandfather was technically in the military. He had been doing crimes as a child, and he was basically told he was either going to go to prison or boot camp, and he decided boot camp. So when this happened, he was already in the military, and they told him, well, since you're here, you can choose what branch you go into. And he decided he was going to join the Navy because he remembered from World War I, the Army slept in the trenches, and he'd rather be in the Navy where you at least had a cot in a boat. So he saw a lot of action in the Pacific. So this was during the campaign for Roosevelt's third term, which was legal. that didn't change until after Roosevelt. And the big thing here was the Lend-Lease Act. This sent a lot of supplies, weapons and supplies to Britain, naval and air patrols to protect the ships. So this was an undeclared naval war between America and Germany. That's a typo there. I'm so used to writing a war between the U.S. and Britain in this class, I guess, that just ended up going on the page. So, undeclared naval war between the U.S. and Germany. So the Lend-Lease Act sent a bunch of stuff to Britain with the understanding that they'd pay for it later because, you know, we're just trying to save them from being destroyed by the Nazi war machine. So here's the invasion of Poland. They were completely decimated. Here's the invasion of Poland with, you know, the Luftwaffe and the Navy and the Army. It was pretty overwhelming. Here's the Royal Air Force. Yesterday I said that was a Hawker Hurricane. It's either a Hawker Hurricane or a Spitfire. Those are the two main planes that the Royal Air Force had. The Spitfire was the big famous one. That one we'll talk more about in my 104 class. But yeah, the Royal Air Force was instrumental in keeping Britain from falling. Here we have a Dr. Seuss illustration about America First. And the wolf chewed up the children and spit out their bones, but there were foreign children and it didn't really matter. So, as much as certain people complain about, oh, there's certain Dr. Seuss, like, Dr. Seuss wasn't quite who they pretend he was. He was not exactly on the side of the far right, for sure. At least not the America First. Hear about the menace of the refugee in America. Are we ready to follow President Roosevelt into war? Joseph E. McKinnon's national commander and other speakers of the Christian mobilizers. So I don't know if this is like, should we go to war? Should we not? I don't know. They're angry about refugees, so that's a thing. All right. Anyway, this is the Lend-Lease Act. I've always liked this picture because it's just like, let's just haul a whole ass tank up and put it in the boat. We're not going to have the British assemble it themselves. We're just going to send them a tank. All right. So obviously we were allied with Britain. The American and British planners agreed that they needed to defeat Germany first. Italy was just like a side thought. And technically Japan was also allied with the Axis powers. So the Atlantic Charter was signed in 1941. And this set the stage for what will become the United Nations. Because obviously the League of Nations is broken down with Germany essentially controlling the entire continent of Europe. But the Atlantic Charter was, well, again, it was this groundwork for the United Nations. It was this meeting between Britain and America, and it was somehow like a stronger union between nations than the League of Nations was. I guess because America was there and like they knew they had to be involved rather than what happened with poor Wilson, where, you know, he made the League of Nations, then it's just like, well, yeah, that's great and all, but America's not going to be involved. So Roosevelt just had to wait for some kind of inciting incident, some kind of excuse to go to war, and he got that, but not from the Atlantic. Now, a lot of times the simple explanation for the attack on Pearl Harbor was, oh, it was a sudden, unprovoked attack from Japan, but it really wasn't. Relations between Japan and the United States had been bad for about 10 years. There was this question of Chinese independence. America, of course, wanted their open door policy. Japanese invasion and occupation of Manchuria. I don't think Nanking had happened yet. The Japanese were pushing into China. The Panay had been sunk in the Yangtze River. And then Japan again joined the Tripatriot Pact, or eventually the Axis powers, which actually it was more an anti-Comintern pact. It was more about containing communist Russia than it was like that Germany and Italy respected Japan. It was, hey, Japan's powerful, they're on the other side of the Soviet Union, so let's work with them. But the big thing was that because they joined Germany and Italy, the U.S. stopped sending them aviation fuel and metal, and they didn't really have access to that otherwise. So their expanding Navy was on limited supplies. So they figured, well, we're with Germany and Italy, and Germany and Italy is fighting, well, I was going to say France and Britain, but mostly just Britain now. And America's obviously joining with Britain, so we're going to have to fight America eventually, so let's wipe out their fleet before it gets started, because our fleet's running out of fuel. So they hit the fleet at Pearl Harbor. Most of the fleet was actually out on maneuver, so it didn't really do as much damage as they meant for it to. And that was all the excuse Congress needed to declare war on Japan, which then resulted in Germany and Italy declaring war on the United States, and now we're in the war. So there's the Atlantic Charter, Newfoundland. Of course, one of the more famous images of Pearl Harbor. And there's all sorts of like conspiracy theories about, oh, the higher-ups knew about the attack coming and they just let it happen because they wanted to go to war. And I mean, maybe, but we don't have any solid proof, so I'm not going down that rabbit hole. So, despite being attacked in the Pacific, our first goal was still fighting the Germans. So we immediately started sending troops and whatnot to Europe. Despite having a common enemy, the Grand Alliance wasn't great. So the Grand Alliance was Britain, the world's leading colonial power, the world's lone communist nation, the Soviet Union. This was after Nazi Germany had invaded the Soviet Union and the bodies started to pile up. I mean, Stalin nearly, literally had a stroke over Hitler suddenly invading. And the only reason he didn't fall entirely is that his subordinates were able to keep things moving while he was wandering around in a daze for a week. And then, of course, capitalism incarnate, the United States. So with continental Europe being under the control of Germany. I mean, the Axis powers technically, but I mean, Italy's there. Most of the fighting was taking place in the Soviet Union. Most of the fighting early in the war was happening in the Soviet Union. And even by the end of the war, that's where 80% of Germany's casualties came from, was in the Soviet Union. We always hear about, oh, the war was won by America. Not really. In Europe, it wasn't. Like, we were important in that we helped to get Britain, like, we helped with pushing into the Western Front and, you know, freeing France and Eastern Europe, or Western Europe, but, like, the USSR did the majority of the work. They're the ones that spent most of the bodies, because that's what Stalin was eager to do, was just send people to die. But like when 80% of Germany's casualties came from fighting the Soviet Union, clearly that's where most of the war was happening. Stalin wanted a second front because, well, he was the only one fighting the war at the time. Yeah, Britain was still like dealing with the occasional raid from the Luftwaffe, but an air fight isn't really a war front. You need infantry on the ground. The British wanted victories in Africa and Eastern Europe because they were more concerned about their holdings there, which left Stalin feeling like, well, Britain and America don't really care about the Soviet Union, so let the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany beat each other to death while they rearm and repair and take their time, which wasn't entirely untrue. I mean, the Soviet Union was seen as the scary enemy before the war happened, and as soon as the war's over, well, we know how the Cold War looked. So, yeah, we weren't super concerned about the Soviet lives being lost. And rather than opening up a new front in France, the Americans, British, and Canadian forces invaded Italy in July of 1943, which was a bad idea. Italy is very mountainous, very rocky, has a lot of real good defensive points. We made very little progress in Italy. Sure, Mussolini ran off, at least for a little while, but Rome wasn't captured until 1944, nearly by the end of the war. We will talk about what eventually happened to Mussolini, but it certainly wasn't the Allies that got rid of him. So they met in Tehran, Iran, because that was like the central point, because you know, obviously Stalin's way over here compared to Britain and Russia, or Britain and America. So they agreed upon a strategy to take Europe, and Stalin agreed to help with the Pacific War once Europe was taken care of, once, you know, Hitler was gone, because, you know, Russia's big, and they're also in the Pacific, technically. And they did somewhat stick to their word. So eventually we did get to D-Day, because, you know, this is an American history class, so we have to stick with the hits. June 6, 1944, largest amphibious assault in military history. Second front in Europe, Paris was liberated by August, so it was a pretty quick war once we finally did get to get landed and moving into things. Much of it was just like fighting in the Soviet Union. Roosevelt won a fourth term and replaced his vice president with Harry Truman, but Roosevelt wasn't long for this world. He was in bad shape. So here we have some folks waiting between fighting, I suppose. This is like actually based on the guns. This is in the Soviet Union. Yeah, those are Soviet guns. This might be Stalingrad, actually. So here's the invasion of Italy. Again, they took them forever to make their way north because of mountainous terrain and entrenched Italian soldiers. Not that the Italian army was especially well trained, but they had the terrain advantage. Here's the big three: Stalin, Roosevelt's having a good time, and Churchill being Churchill. D-Day. Oh, other thing that popular media likes to exaggerate. D-Day wasn't the crazy disaster that most media likes to show. There were like 12 beaches, I think. I forget exactly how many beaches that they landed at. And only 2 of them had any kind of real resistance. And those are always the ones that you see in, movies and video games and anything having to do with D-Day, because that's the exciting bit. If you just, have a war movie where they roll in and there's like 5 German dudes in a little hut and like, damn, there's a lot of Americans and British coming in. I guess we should probably call our superiors and run. That's not real exciting. Most of the beach landings look like this. They just rolled in and started piling out because they had multiple diversions and espionage stuff going on that made the German forces think they were going to attack in a different place. There's all sorts of real cool spy shit going on in World War II. So, Soviet Union did most of the fighting in Eastern Europe, and the U.S. is what really did the stuff in the Pacific. As I said, my grandfather, he drove the transport boats that moved the soldiers to shore, but usually like the second wave. I don't know if he ever actually got shot at. So he did a lot of looting. He would pull up to the islands and then just get out and start taking crap from dead bodies. My grandfather wasn't a good man. He brought a lot of loot home. So, General MacArthur and Nimitz, 2-pronged assault through Japanese-occupied islands. The Japanese had moved eastward quite a bit. This war is, or this portion of the war is what took the longest. I mean, it took us forever to really get into Europe. We were fighting the Pacific for a long time. First major battle is at the Battle of Coral Sea off the northwest coast of Australia, followed by the Battle of Midway, which is the most famous, probably one of the most famous battles in the Pacific. But the Battle of Coral Sea was first, and that was our first major victory. So, hint, hint, that's probably a thing I can ask you guys. Guadalcanal Island took 6 months, and it was like anything you just imagined from Vietnam. It was bad. The Japanese were dug in. They had spider holes and what do they call punchy sticks? All sorts of spike traps, and they'd be in the trees, and it was rough. And same thing happened with the Mariana Islands, Marshall Islands, and Philippines. But by the end of 1944, the American forces had pushed through. So by 1945, they had gotten to Japan. However, Iwo Jima and Okinawa were even more intense with the Japanese soldiers being told to fight to the last man, and they often would. While this was happening in the U.S. Army, because we didn't have an Air Force yet, the Army had the Air Force, they were doing bombing raids over Tokyo, killing about 330,000 civilians to try to wear down Japan's economy. It should be mentioned that the firebombing raids, which obviously aren't as well talked about as the atomic bombs because those are big and shiny. There are stories of people in Japan like jumping into ditches full of water to escape the fire and being boiled alive, or even people getting to bomb shelters before the bombing started, and the fire being so intense that the air would be sucked out of the shelters because of the intense heat outside, or they'd be baked. Like, even in a bomb shelter, you can't survive a firebombing. The firebombings were real bad. They're just napalm. And napalm doesn't stop burning until it's done burning. You don't put out napalm. However, the government refused to yield because the government was largely being run by the military at this point. And by this point also, they were basically running out of fuel, so they began using kamikaze attacks, kamikaze meaning divine wind. Wasn't enough fuel to go around, so they would use these suicidal attacks against American warships and planes because they didn't have enough fuel to go and bomb ships and then come back. So it's like, well, use your plane as a weapon too. Good luck. So here we have the Battle of Coral Sea with the aircraft carriers, which were like the new big thing in World War II. Battleships were no longer like the dominating factor. Also the Battle of Coral Sea. I'm trying to remember where the Yamato was fought. The Yamato, I think, was just kind of out by itself. It was this massive battleship. I think it was called like a super battleship because of how big it was. And it was defeated by like little tiny planes because it just had a bunch of huge cannons and it had no defense against planes. There's the Battle of Midway. Firebombing of Tokyo. The result of that. Interestingly enough, Shin Godzilla actually had a scene that called back to the firebombing of Tokyo, which is not something you usually see in one of those films. Usually it's the ones that are more serious are usually just about the atomic bomb, but this one actually depicted Tokyo on fire, which was pretty horrific. So, to end the war, we had the Yalta Agreement between the powers before the war was actually over, establishing permanent governments in Eastern Europe. Russia didn't really like this idea because it had been invaded through Poland twice and felt like it needed to set up its own government in Poland as a buffer zone. And then also, they needed to figure out how to establish a Germany. It would eventually be partitioned out, as well as Berlin, into 4 zones, which we'll talk about in a minute. So the Nazi forces did have one final push to the west into the American and British forces at the Battle of the Bulge. But it was too little too late, and the Allied forces started pushing into Germany. Obviously, the Soviets got there first. April 30th, 1945. Hitler saw the writing on the wall and knew that if the Soviets caught him, he would not be dying a quick death. So he capped himself after taking cyanide just to make sure it stuck. Mussolini had been killed by anti-fascist partisans days before in Italy. Let's say Mussolini didn't die quickly. He was dragged in through the streets and hung upside down with piano wire, if I recall correctly. And to this day, whenever there are like openly fascist people running for government, the anti-fascist side of the political sphere just takes their picture and hangs it upside and just like flips it upside down, just to remind them what happens to fascists in Italy. Italy's politics are interesting. So German troops surrendered in Italy on May 2nd, and the remainder of the government surrendered on May 7th. Meanwhile, the Manhattan Project has been working since 1942 to construct an atomic bomb. I mentioned to my class yesterday that in the cleanup of Germany, there were a lot of sites found where pieces of, I should say pieces of atomic bombs because that's not the proper way to put it, but where like steps of making atomic bombs were found. Like they weren't quite there yet, but they were working towards it. So that's a scary alternate history potential, is that the Germans would have gotten there first. Which actually, the whole like purging Nazi Germany of lots of people, including say a certain Albert Einstein, probably made it so they didn't get the atomic bomb first. So sucks for you guys. Yeah, the Manhattan Project was led by Robert Oppenheimer. Japan refused unconditional surrender because it would have also meant they had to get rid of their emperor. And even though he was basically just a figurehead, you know, like the British monarch, but we can't let anybody else have a monarch. The Enola Gay dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima, August 6, 1945, killing 80,000 civilians instantly and tens of thousands more later on through injury and radiation. And 100,000 at Nagasaki 3 days later when that wasn't enough. And then the USSR invaded Manchuria to show that they couldn't be used as a mediation for any kind of peace talks. Because that's what the USSR had been up until this point, is they were still sort of a neutral ground between Japan and America. And Japan had been going to the USSR to mediate, just to try to, you know, get talks with the U.S., and then they invaded Manchuria, which was technically under Japanese control at the time. And Japan realized, oh no, we can't keep this up. And also, like, there's a lot of back and forth between the emperor and like the government that was controlled by the military. But again, I don't have time to go into that. Here's the big three. Oh, I think I said it wrong last time. That is Winston Churchill. And then Harry Truman and Stalin. I was saying that first one was FDR, but that's wrong. Because actually, before the end of the war, Churchill was also replaced. He didn't die, he just got replaced because they decided they didn't like him anymore. So here's the Battle of the Bulge. It actually ended up stranding a number of American soldiers, and that, again, makes for good drama for movies and TV shows and whatnot. It was very harrowing. There is the Soviet soldier raising the flag over the Reichstag. Also the end of Call of Duty World at War, one of the better Call of Duty games. This is Oak Ridge. This is in Tennessee. My dad's side of the family actually worked here. This is where they made part of the atomic bomb without actually knowing what they were making. It was like they had part of an assembly line and like a screen here and a screen here, and part of it came through, and they were told like what to do on this specific part, and then it went through to the next part, and then the next person was told what to do on that specific part without anybody being told what they were doing. And even at the end of the sequence, it was still like a small inert piece of the bomb that would go to somewhere else to be worked on. It was all very secretive. But then once it was all out in the public, Oak Ridge was very popular, very proud of what they had done, and they call it Atomic City now. I mean, it's still called Oak Ridge, but like their nickname is Atomic City. Anyway, there's Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And the aftermath. All right. Now, obviously, that's not the end of the chapter, because we have what was going on during the war. One such thing being the Holocaust, because as troops were pushing through Germany, they were discovering, oh wait, there's a lot of bad stuff going on here. So they discovered the Nazi concentration camps, killing through either execution or simply working to death 6 million Jews and 5 million other undesirables for the Nazis. Slavs, Poles, Gypsies, which is technically a slur, should be Romani, homosexuals, and those who were physically and mentally disabled, and also the communists. So yeah, the concentration camps had a wide berth in who they were getting rid of. And even those who were found still alive were seen as the living dead. They were all skin and bones. It should also be mentioned, I talked about this in my 104 class, before the war actually began, the Nazis burned a lot of literature that they saw as being too leftist. And I say one bit, but like one major component of that literature was the largest collection of like transgender studies in the world at the time, because it was in Germany. So yeah, just FYI. This was shocking to the public, but the Allies had known about it since 1942. Roosevelt and Churchill felt like actually doing anything about it would be too risky, and they needed to end the war to fix things. However, while you can argue, well, yeah, I guess you should actually like go in and actually liberate the whole area, because if you just went in and specifically took the camps, it would be dangerous. But the U.S. also specifically turned back boatloads of refugees trying to get away from Germany. Only 21,000 Jews managed to find asylum in the U.S. Many more were turned away and forced back to Germany and Poland, where many of them ended up in said camps. And a lot of this was due to the State Department being full of anti-Semites, because, of course, Roosevelt expressed sympathy for the plight of Hitler's victims, but he felt that ending the war would be the best way to help them. You know, not just ignoring the fact that we sent them back in the first place. So here we have some of the folks being liberated. I think this was in Japan, so this is a slightly different thing. Or maybe it's not. I don't know. Here we have the Jewish refugee ship being sent back. Give me your tired, your poor, send those, the hopeless, tempest tossed to me, except for, those that are about to be exterminated. Now, this is the rest of the chapter, is stuff going on in America. The Second World War was what stopped the Great Depression. Created the military-industrial complex. Let me make sure I'm just hitting the big parts here because we are running short on time. Federal budget went from $9 billion to $100 billion. GDP went from 91 to 166 billion. Yada, yada, yada. Unemployment dropped. Prosperity everywhere, manufacturing, from automobile plants to tank plants, which is cool. Agricultural South, military camps, textile plants, naval shipyards, West Coast, lots of naval shipyards, because, again, the Pacific Ocean. So the federal deficit went really high in World War II, but it was important to get all that stuff out, and it helped us to get out of the Depression. And this is like, cheering on the people working in the factories. Like, just because you're not out over there fighting the Germans or the Japanese doesn't mean you're not helping out in the war. So here we have women working in these manufacturing jobs. And that's it? Okay. Come on. War Powers Act, the President had authority to reorganize federal agencies. War Production Board, businesses were enticed to meet government orders. Antitrust legislation was suspended, so conglomerates come together to meet demands. Government sold $100 billion in bonds, passed taxes, lower middle-income Americans. Military went from $250,000 to $12 million. Obviously, it was still segregated because it's still the 40s, because, obviously. But still, these segregated troops, such as the Tuskegee Air Corps, continue to distinguish themselves in combat. This Tuskegee Air Corps, again, could be its own lesson. This Tuskegee Air Corps was really cool. National War Labor Board, they were a pretty big thing. Regulated wages, hours, working conditions, authorized government to take over plants, which is pretty close to what the Soviet Union was doing, but we're not going to talk about that. Smith-Connolly Act prohibited walkouts, 30-day cooling off period. I don't think I talked about Smith-Connolly Act. Salvage station, bringing tin. Let's win the trophy, Army Ordnance Safety Contest. Yeah, don't let your ordnance go off. Together we win, blah, blah, blah. Here's the Tuskegee Air Corps. I think that's a Mustang behind them. I really like World War II era planes. They were super cool. Give them stuff to fight with. People working nights. No condition from home. All right, come on. Employed women rose more than 50%. Married women outnumbered single women in the working sector. This was largely because they were older and without young children, so they were about 60% of the workforce. Part of this was because there wasn't any kind of like child care facilities. You couldn't just like drop your kid off at daycare and then go to work. That wasn't a thing. There was the Kaiser Corporation shipyards, which had child care facilities on site 24/7. So you could like go to the shipyard to make your ships or whatever, and just like drop your kid off at the on-site daycare. That's kind of cool. And not even daycare, like 24/7 childcare. If you got an 11 o'clock shift, cool, bring Junior, drop him off. He's got a place to be. It's safe and secure. This was pretty rare in the U.S., but it was normal in places like Britain because, again, it seems like the European countries tend to take care of their children and elders better than the United States. At least they used to. Women paid less than men for the same jobs because, obviously, and despite depictions of strong women like Rosie the Riveter, there were still many gender stereotypes. They would compare industrial jobs to domestic jobs, cranes as clothes wringers, wire spools like crocheting. It's like, what are you idiots talking about? Have you not seen what these wire spools look like? They're terrifying. They're massive. Women were treated as temporarily occupying men's jobs. You know, a lot of that. Here's these child care facilities. You know, just come in, put your shoes on the table and go to sleep. There's Rosie the Riveter. I'm sure everybody's seen that at some time or another. Join us in a victory job. That's a really cool way of putting it. I mean, have a job that helps us come to victory over, you know, the evil, scary Nazis. And also like Imperial Japan, I guess. This is a British thing. Hold on, Russia, arms from London are coming. Because the Russian women were out there fighting. One of the best snipers in Russia was a woman during the war. Anyway, on the home front, morale was relatively high. Increased prosperity. We weren't losing as many men as like the British and especially the Soviets. Office of War Information, promoting patriotism. Had the USO, the United Service Organization, collecting scrap metal, victory gardens, etc. Hollywood got on board. They did lots of propaganda, depicting the heroics of American soldiers, our Russian allies, which would immediately change in 1945, keeping the troops entertained. But the men were at war and the women were at work, and unless where the women were working had a daycare, children were often left at home. So these so-called latchkey kids, which is a term I didn't hear until my cousin mentioned it because her father was in the military and her mother was always working, so she was just like, where you're given a key and as soon as you get home from school, you just like, or once you get off school, you just like walk home and you're home by yourself. They often became delinquents, dropping out of high school. But in this period, they would often find some kind of job to help the family. And with the war winding down, soldiers returning home, marriages began increasing and the baby boom began. But also with all the stresses of the war, and husbands and wives being separated for several years, the divorce rate increased as well, which is not something people usually talk about with, you know, when things were better back in the day. It's like, yeah, because half the population didn't have rights. Anyway, here's a weapon, don't waste it. Food. Wait, hold on. What is that hat? That's fantastic. Looks like a bird. Anyway. Wanted for murder. Careless talk costs lives. So again, much like we saw in World War I, where, you know, don't talk about things you hear. Here's USO, camp shows. USO did a lot of cool stuff. Keeping the troops entertained. Latchkey kid. Look how cool this kid looks. That's some 1940s era delinquent stuff right there. I like it. Here's the kids just like sitting in empty shells. It was either that or time off until a day nursery is organized. It's like, oh, okay. I like this picture. All right. Come on. So the Fair Employment Practice Committee was created by executive order by FDR, and the context for this is pretty neat. So A. Philip Randolph, who was in charge of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, applied these labor union ideas to civil rights. Basically, he was going to organize a 100,000 person march on D.C. To protest racial discrimination in the government and these various industries and the military. And this was right before America actually got into the war, so Roosevelt didn't want this march to embarrass the government. So he met with Randolph, and Eleanor was there as well because she was much better with people than he was. And eventually, Randolph called off the march in return for the Fair Employment Practice Committee that was made to not eliminate segregation and, well, it was meant to eliminate segregation, but it at least reduced the amount of inequality in jobs. Meanwhile, NAACP won a case in Texas, outlawed all white Democratic primaries in the one-party South, which, you know, is something that Florida's trying to do. Or the opposite of which. Florida's trying to get rid of opposing parties. Congress Racial Equality protested against racial inequality in public accommodations, which would be later protest in the civil rights era. Housing couldn't keep up, tensions spilling out in transportation and recreation facilities. 240 riots in 1943 alone. One in Chicago killed 24 people. So again, Chicago being a largely populated area, saw a lot of riots. So the FEPC, to appeal to the white worker, was like, hey, if they can take the right of the black worker away just because he's black, why don't they could use any excuse to take your rights away as well? You know, just because you're white and that's the current advantageous thing. Hey, what if they decide, well, you've got Irish ancestry and we don't want people with Irish ancestry in here anymore, and then they just kick you out. So we need this thing, which was something that was actually used like way back, right after the Reconstruction, of just like, you know, hey, discriminating against black people because they're black might not be hurting white people now, but that's a real bad precedent to set because it can be used for anything down the road. And even like the most racist white person is like, I can see how this can be bad later, so maybe I shouldn't support this. So there's the March on Washington movement. So there was actually increased immigration from Mexico. This was on purpose. Get more laborers, or braceros. Most of the U.S. residents of Mexican ancestry were actually American citizens. Mexican Americans became more conscious of their civil rights. They felt that working together against fascism made them feel more American. They weren't just like people who were originally from Mexico and now they're American, they're just here, but they're more American now. In Texas, they joined the League of United Latin American Citizens. In Southern California, they organized boycotts against segregation. Obviously, though, there was hostility because white people be white people. Los Angeles, once again, typo, apologies. Mexican-American teenagers joined gangs identified by wearing colorful zoot suits. That's a fun word, and I decided to put it on the test, so remember that one. Mexican-American teenagers, yada, yada, yada. Not everyone who wore these suits were gang members. This was just like the style for the teenagers at the time. Obviously, white Americans didn't make the distinction between the gang members and the teenagers who just liked the outfit. June 4th, 1943, squads of seamen stationed along Long Beach invaded Mexican-American neighborhoods, attacked zoot suiters and those without the suits in the Zoot Suit riots. And in the end, the result was that the outfit was outlawed rather than maybe we shouldn't let sailors come in and just like beat teenagers in the streets. But you know, but make this illegal, not this. All right, let's go. We're almost done. Come on. All right, so civil liberties weren't as impacted in the Second World War as they were in the First because most people were okay with the war. Communists were opposed for a little while, but once Germany invaded the USSR, they supported the war. Germany and Italy were, despite being in the war, the Germans and Italians in the United States were largely integrated. Japanese Americans, though, were still pretty segregated and in their own little alcoves, so hoo boy, things got bad. 1,500 Italians and 11,000 Germans were arrested. We'll talk about that in just a minute. However, nearly everyone in America of Japanese descent, whether they were citizens or not, were arrested and sent to internment camps. That's a nice way of saying concentration camps, because they were concentrated into small numbers, small groups, in Arizona, Arkansas, California, Colorado, etc. And in Hawaii, which had a large Japanese population, the entire population was put under martial law. Numbers in these camps reached about 100,000, 2/3 of which were citizens. Germans and Italians were questioned individually if they were seen as being disloyal. However, anyone who looked Japanese was arrested. However, 18,000 Japanese Americans did manage to convince the government to let them join the army. Saw fierce fighting in Europe with the 442nd Regiment, which became one of the most decorated units in the military. Obviously, they were in Europe because, we can't let them fight in the Pacific because they might go native. And they were sent to like the worst parts of the fighting in Europe, but they did prove they were loyal. Chinese and Filipinos were slightly better treated during this period, but not a whole lot. And it should be mentioned, George Takei, if you're familiar with him, he was about this size when this happened. He remembers being pulled out of his house and standing in a line with his parents and family and being shipped off to a camp in, I think it was Colorado. He remembers the winters being very cold there and not much insulation in the little cabins that were built. And they were just like piled in. And it was just, if you have Japanese ancestry, you're considered an enemy of the nation. So to end things, and the conclusion's a lot, so don't leave yet. Roosevelt tried to maintain neutrality, and as with Lincoln, he just had to wait for a blatant enemy attack. It ended the Great Depression, expanded rights for African Americans, heightened Mexican Americans' consciousness of oppression, and obviously the rights of Japanese Americans were trampled on. Women were pushed into the workforce, and the war pushed the U.S. on a world stage. as one of the two major world powers. And let's see if this works. No. Where's my sound? It's supposed to play the Looney Tunes theme. I found this in the recycle bin at Tri-County Tech, and I was like, I'm going to keep this. Okay, so here's what we have, like 4 minutes, and I'm just going to talk about next week. So for this class and my next class, we're going to review on Monday, and for this class, the test is on Wednesday, in here at 8:30, so normal time for you guys. You guys have the best slot. Tuesday is reading day, which for Francis Marion means no class, but typically the professors are around. Now, I live in Florence, so normally I wouldn't just be around. But since I really wanted to do the movie, I was thinking that Tuesday I might show up here anyway, and if any of you want to come in, I'll have the Atomic Cafe, which is the documentary, and then Dr. Strangelove, which is technically it's just a regular movie, but it's also from around that period. Both of those are Cold War stuff, since we didn't get to Cold War here. For each of those, I'm going to have a sign-up sheet. Extra credit on the exam. It's like 2 points apiece. If you watch both, it's 5. I'm going to come in here at 8:30 because they're both. I mean, the first one's a little bit longer than an hour and a half. And then we'll have like an intermission between the two. You know, if you want to bring food and drink, fine. Just don't make a mess. But how many of you are actually like interested in that? Because if you'd rather sleep, that's fine. It's not required. But how many would consider coming in on a Tuesday? Do you come in for extra credit? Okay, cool. I mean, if you don't want to, you don't have to, because there's still going to be extra credit on the test. That's not changed. The final's going to have extra credit. But I figured since we've crammed for the final, I'll give you guys a little extra credit as kind of an apology. Okay, cool. So I'll see you guys on Monday for the review, and then Tuesday for the thing. Lorenzo, your third test is in the front office. Cool.